Welcome to Taste of Truth Tuesdays, where we'll be serving up bite-sized conversations on all things fitness, nutrition, mindset, and spirituality. So grab your headphones and get ready to taste the truth with us every Tuesday. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform because every bite counts. Hey, welcome back to Taste of Truth Tuesdays. Today's episode connects beautifully with a past episode that many of you resonated with, which was called Science or Stagnation, the Risk of Unquestioned Paradigms. And in that episode, we talked a lot about scientism, not science itself, but the dogma that forms around certain scientific ideas. In that episode, we focused on Rupert Sheldrake. And if you are unaware of him, he is not a fringe crank by any means. He is a Cambridge-trained biologist who dared to question what he calls the 10 dogmas of modern science. He says that contemporary science is based on the claim that all reality is material or physical. There is no reality but material reality. Consciousness is a byproduct of the physical activity of the brain. Matter is unconscious. Evolution is purposeless. Everything is mechanical. Dogs, for example, are complex mechanisms rather than living organisms with goals of their own. Even people are machines, lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase, with brains that are likely genetically programmed computers. And with that, there's 10 of these scientific creeds, but the last one is mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. And together, these beliefs make up the physiology or ideology of materialism, whose central assumption is that everything is essentially material or physical, even our minds. And so this belief system has become dominant within science since the late 19th century, and now it's taken for granted. But see, in everyday usage, materialism refers to a way of life devoted entirely to material interests, like preoccupation with wealth, possessions, and luxury. And so in the spirit of radical skepticism, that's what this episode is all about. It's definitely not bite-sized. It's a long one today. We're exploring a theory that's called Social Miasm Theory, and it fits right inside that tension between mainstream assumptions and the alternative frameworks we can often dismiss way too quickly. And who we have on today is my friend, Stephinity Salazar. And she just published a fascinating piece of research, and she's going to break it down more for us. And let me just say, you don't have to agree with everything. That's not the goal here. What I love is the chance to explore, to ask good questions, and to stay grounded while examining ideas that stretch our own understanding. So with that, let's dive into social miasm theory. What is it? Where it comes from, why it matters, and what it might reveal about the world we're living in today. All right, everyone. I am here with my dear friend Stephinity, and we've just been chatting before we push record, and I'm just so excited to introduce her ideas, and just this conversation we're going to have. So will you just introduce yourself, share with the audience, who are you, share a little bit about your background, maybe how we know each other, and just anything that you feel called to share.
Absolutely. Thank you, Megan, for hosting me on your show. It's been a long time coming. And so I originally know Megan as Groovin' Megs. And for all of you who aren't aware, Megan used to be a professional hoop dancer, like performance hooper, like hula hoop and circus arts and fire dancing. And I was as well. And I co-created a international hoop troupe called Kaivalya. And Megan was part of our contingency. She wasn't locally based in Colorado like some of the rest of us, but whenever we would have big shows with String Cheese Incident or other groups, Megan would be a part of our troupe. And yeah, we have this whole world as circus artists, performance artists, festival and Burning Man attendees. And yeah, that's how we originally met each other. It's been really beautiful to see how we've co-evolved along the years, and we've only grown stronger in our truth seeking and our refining of ourselves. And it's just been a beautiful journey to have you on this planet as an ally in all things truth related. So thank you, Megan.
Oh man, I really needed that pep talk and I appreciate that. And yeah, I am just tickled to have you on the podcast and to pick your brain. And just I thought it was so cool and congratulations on having some research published. Like whenever we're out here kind of, breaking paradigms or challenging the consensus, something that really gets you accepted in this world of skepticism is definitely getting something published. You tend to kind of break through some barriers with that. So congratulations. I can't wait for us to get to that point. But can you just kind of start it off with the basics? Like what is a miasm? What is even homeopathy? Because I know there's some skepticism around that. So can you just catch us up with some basic terms that we need to understand before we dive into the nitty-gritty?
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll be talking today about social miasm theory. That's what I have coined this particular theory. And it is very multifaceted. To back up before we go over a few terms with what Megan was talking about, I have recently been published in Journal for Scientific Exploration, 39.2. It's available online. And it's JSC is the Journal for Society for Scientific Exploration. So it is a group of scientists who are also aware that there's a lot of dogma and orthodoxy within the science and want to be able to explore topics that are beyond the standard model and orthodoxy that is still taught and preached in universities that's agenda based for the most part. It originated with a lot of scientists and military that were part during the Cold War that were used in remote viewing and other psi phenomena. So there it is. SSE is very psi and remote viewing uh, emphasized, but they also incorporate a lot of other subjects, including my specialty, which is in frequency medicine and bioenergetic medicine and natural medicine modalities. And in the case of this particular work, I dive deeper in a lot of appendage subjects, which we'll learn about. So yeah, so the publishing was a long time coming. It was originally a dissertation for my doctorates. I have 2 medical science doctorates in bioenergetic medicine, BD, natural medicine, DNM. This is a more common designation in parts of Europe, but we do have DNMs and BDs in America and a few schools that allow such. But the BD is frequency medicine based, which is obviously a really large subject. I also have a ministerial, and I also want to make clear in this presentation that we're going to be giving that I am not an MD. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a BD and a DNM. And you are sovereign beings. I'm a sovereign being. I do not diagnose. So please be aware of that sort of information. This is my disclosure for all people who are aware that the AMA Gestapo are definitely have control over certain words and aspects. So I just want to be very clear for people so there's no misunderstandings on that. And yeah, before that, I have a background in biophysics, biochemistry. And then prior to my continuing education, my undergrad is a BA in philosophy and religious studies. And I have tons of different certifications, including Doris. Through Dora, I am an energy psychotherapist, as well as other certifications. So I do come from some knowledge, both formally and very much so informally with everything that I've researched. So moving forward, thank you for that, allowing that introduction. So social miasm theory, I borrow heavily from classical homeopathy. And classical homeopathy is an entire philosophy and system unto itself. I think a lot of people aren't aware of that, how large of a scope and paradigmatic homeopathy is. And in homeopathy, when we're dealing with chronic illness, which is called a miasm. So the miasm is a term for chronic illness. It's paradigmatically different than in allopathic or MD type medicine. And what everything for MDs, you have a symptom, they give it a name and they call it a disease. And you might have 5, 6, 7 plus different diseases. You have 5, 6, 7 different specialists. A lot of them aren't communicating with each other. They still don't seem to recognize this is one whole body, one whole unit. Everything is interconnected. And in homeopathy, when we're talking about chronic illness or miasm, all of those quote unquote diseases are just symptoms. They're different symptoms, and it's the underlying pattern that is what we would refer to as the dis-ease. And so there's only about 5 miasms that have been fully tracked and recognized, and they compound upon each other. And there is also a psychological element and a mental, emotional type element, and even a spiritual element above that. And they're all connected, and the mentals and emotionals are the emotional is the bridge to the mental, right? When we look at our endocrine system, it's our molecules of emotion, our neurotransmitters, and then the mental is above that, and the spiritual is above that. And those are considered deeper. Like the emphasis is on the mentals, but the physicals have a component as well. And so what they're looking for in homeopathy is a frequency match. And this goes with acute as well as chronic, but you're looking for a match of something that has been tracked. It can be a toxin of some type, a salt, a rock, a plant. There's various different things that they have created frequency remedies out of, but they're looking for the match of when a perfectly healthy human overdoses on too much of that specific thing. And depending on what it is, it might be a large amount or a very small amount, like snake venom, right? But what those symptoms look like in an individual that has been poisoned, that we look at individual who has not taken any of that, but they're expressing that same resonant frequency. And so they're matching it. And so they're giving it in a minute dose so that the body can then read that frequency and respond accordingly. So that's what that looks like. And there's been so much criticism of homeopathy throughout the years. The Carnegie and Rockefellers in the earlier times, a century ago with the Flexner report, were very much against all natural medicines and homeopathy, which was really big in this country a couple, like 150 years ago. And they did a huge propaganda campaign against it, calling it snake oil, in part because they did not understand the technology behind water as a storage and transference unit that we know today. There is so much research in the realm of water, starting with Gerald Pollack, Veda Austin, and so many others that are Ian Denise, Luc Montagnier, who recently passed, on information and memory storage within water. And all the different phases of water too. Water can be a plasma. There's multiple different phases of water, right? It's not just solid, liquid, vapor. And so they didn't have that type of information back in the day. So I understand the healthy skepticism, but what is most important is that homeopathy works. We know today scientifically why it works. It wasn't as clear 100, 150 years ago. But what's also really interesting is during the times of World War II, both sides, both forces bombed all the ozone clinics, homeopathy clinics, all of the sanatorium clinics and the water clinics, hydrotherapy, basically natural medicine clinics that existed at the time, and magically left perfectly intact all these massive pharmaceutical buildings and structures. And we see after the end of World War II, the rise of big pharma and petroleum-based medicine and a one-size-fits-all approach. And I want to be really clear too, I think allopathy does have its place in the world, especially when it comes to trauma medicine. Allopathy is incredible. You get in a car accident, your arm is hanging off or whatever the situation might be, and you have to go in for emergency surgery, and they are able to save lives. And there are certain types of emergency surgeries that are absolutely necessary that require a lot of knowledge and precision. And so I want to give my props to that aspect of allopathies. But when we're talking about allopathy in this conversation, in this context, we're going to be talking about chronic illness and big pharma and that one-size-fits-all approach. Because it's my opinion, when it comes to allopathic medicine, they are on point with trauma medicine, and they, for the most part, are doing an incredible work and saving lives. But when it comes to chronic illness, they have absolutely no idea what illness even is. So how on earth are they able to actually, help people and allow for true cure, as they like to say it, because they're just really palliating compounding illnesses until the patient finally falls ill from too much.
Yeah. And I'm really looking forward to just kind of getting deeper into what you said kind of down here at the end. We're going to be talking about COVID as a catalyst. And I think we saw that a lot in how they were treating the individuals sick in the hospital. Super scary stuff. That definitely is what woke me up. I mean, I was always skeptical about big pharma being like a crunchy hippie, trying to be healthy in the world. But man, has my awareness just grown and grown and grown. I did not know that about World War II. We have talked about the Fletcher report in past episodes, but I am not shocked to hear that by any means. So, was there a specific, and I appreciate you kind of setting the groundwork for us. So, was there a specific light bulb moment that happened for you, or like a personal experience or something that helped you kind of kick off the social miasm theory?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like social miasm theory is at least 20, 30 years, if not a lifetime in the making. I really pull from all of my polymathic research and work for it, as we'll, when we get into the essence of the truth component, we'll see. But it had been, I've always been into health and health related subjects. My father was pretty forward thinking in that aspect of things. And I myself have been through various phases of being poisoned, toxified. A few of them were my own stupidity, but there were a few instances where I had been in the wrong place at the wrong time and been severely poisoned. That'd be a whole episode conversation. But suffice it to say, I've seen the areas like myself where I've had really high voltage. As a child, I was a professional and competitive athlete. And I was expected to go to the Olympics in swimming. I was also a competitive skier and runner. I excelled at pretty much anything I wanted to do. I've seen where my voltage has completely dropped. And I've been in places where I've had chronic fatigue, where I could barely get out of bed. And I've had to crawl out of that hole and comprehend what's going on with me, what has happened. Where in some cases I knew the culprit, in other cases I did not know. And so I'm kind of a living proof of the story of humanity in a lot of ways. I'm a microcosm of that. And so I would say that it was around 2015 that I recognized the direction that society was starting to go in with their confusion. What should we eat? What's this? What's that? And there was a lot of misinformation. And I had a little bit of a presupposition that there was going to be a health crisis on this planet in some way, shape, or form, and a lot of misinformation. I didn't quite know what that was going to look like, but I just felt that it was coming. And I was just finishing up my doctorates at IBEM when COVID broke. And it was also right around the time, about a year prior, I had just started learning about homeopathy because I grew up thinking homeopathy was snake oil because that's what my family thought. And my father was very wise in many ways, but he sort of took to that agenda. My father's also from the Great Generation. So he fought in World War II, and he was, as free thinking as he was in some aspects, he was also indoctrinated in other aspects. So it wasn't until I started taking homeopathy and reading about it and learning about it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like part of the missing piece. Since I was already very frequency medicine oriented and frequency oriented in general, I have a lot of knowledge in the subject of biophysics and in physics itself. I've taken to various unified physics modalities and learnings. I even teach it now to doctorate students. And so it all really brought everything together. And it was like the missing piece to this totality of perspective that for me, with the research into pathogenesis and like what is disease? What is the origin of disease? Like what causes it? And how can we get ourselves out of it individually and collectively as a species and truly work to heal our ancestry, right? A lot of us are talking these days about clearing our ancestry, clearing past problems. And this is a huge component of it. And the answers for the resolution of it, once you learn the theory, does not have to be in homeopathy. Homeopathy is the philosophy and the springboard for which to comprehend the totality. Homeopathy can work to heal miasm, but there's other modalities that exist as well.
Okay, cool. I appreciate you sharing that. And I can see how your whole life has prepared you kind of for putting this together. And that's why it's probably so exciting for friends who've known you for 20 plus years to kind of see this evolution and to co evolve with you. So, what is social miasm theory?
So again, I take the idea from homeopathy of what is miasm and I broaden it to the social sphere to speak it in the most concise way. So we are a society of individuals, right? The individuals create the collective consciousness, and not only with us as humans, but our animals, our plants, the whole ecological sphere, right? We're one giant organism here on planet Earth. And so that's the totality of the scope. And I take it through time as well. So quintessentially, what is social miasm theory? It is the suppression of toxemia, trauma, and truth. Homeopathy has a huge symbolic metaphor throughout its philosophy on suppression. And it focuses mostly on suppression of toxemia, but it also gets into a little bit on trauma. And there's one or two past classical homeopathists of the past who go into a little bit within the truth component. But I feel like the truth component being most foundational, right? It's the least dense of the three categories. It's the most foundational and it's so far fetched and it's right in front of our face and we don't even see it. And so suppression of toxemia, which is the final layer, right? That's the layer that we start to see the physical symptoms of. And that's the layer that's come last. But the two most classic examples is you get a rash, right? And you suppress the rash with a steroid, or there's biologic injections you can take now. And in the past, it's been like suppression with arsenic or ointments of lead or zinc or other things. And that would get rid of the rash because it's a toxin that's trying to come out. Our skin is our second set of lungs. It's a barrier, but it's also a detoxifying agent. And so if there's something toxic within our bodies, we see this a lot in children and babies, you want it to come out. And there are ways in which you can allow for that rash to come out without causing serious damage or pain for the individual. But the idea is you do not want to suppress, because when you bring it back in on itself, you create a deeper illness that's going to come later, that's going to go into a deeper system of the body, right? Our most external system is our skin, and it's the one that allows for us, true detox. Whereas if it goes deeper into the nephrotic system and the kidneys or other layers, you're going to have much more serious consequences over time. And another classic example is suppression of a fever, right? A lot of people, they're like, oh, I have a fever, I'm going to take an antipyretic, but it's like your body is purposely burning out something that it doesn't want in its system. And I've had this happen to myself as well, where I was working at an athletic club, and there I was tasked with cleaning a lot of the equipment after use with a well-known biotoxin, an IG Farman, Operation Paperclip, neurotoxin, similar toxins that are used on glyphosate and other things. And I was spraying it and atomizing it and cleaning it. And I was doing this when I was young, right? I was in my early 20s. I didn't question it. I didn't think about it. I started getting really, really painful periods and menstrual cycles, chronic fatigue. At one point, I had a healing crisis and my body started aching and fevering up. And instead of allowing that to express itself through, I went to the hospital. They injected me with steroids and saline. I felt so much better. But within weeks, my energy and physicality and health and IQ, for that matter, completely plummeted. And I had to, heal myself out of that and through that. And something similar has happened a few times in my life. And, and so that's an example, right, of suppression and toxemia. And there's a lot more other examples. And then suppression of trauma, as we know, we live in a society that for hundreds and hundreds of years has conditioned men to think that if they express emotion or if they cry, they're weak. And I think there's something to be said about the extreme that we're also seeing with overly xenoestrogenic of people that victimize themselves, that have kind of pendulumed in the other way. So I'm not speaking to that, but I'm speaking to our centuries of men that have not been able to express themselves and be emotional and cry at a funeral because they don't want to be considered weak. So there's this suppression element. And the same thing happens with women in the case of we've lived for centuries of women who have suffered extreme abuse from husbands, particularly from Abrahamic onwards, but not just then, isolated conditions. But we've seen the suppression of the divine feminine on this planet for a few thousand years. And women have suffered extreme abuse, but were codependent on men, had nowhere to go. And we also see that in cases of rape or incest, where people are like, oh, don't tell anybody you were raped because then you'll be outcasted. And so we have both men and women having suffered severe cases of having to suppress their own emotions. There are certain cultures that also, as a whole, like you don't express yourself. And there's something to be said, when we look at the animal kingdom, for example, we have an antelope running from a lion. And if they escape, you see that they shake, right? They're like releasing that cortisol from their system. And we live in a society where we haven't allowed ourselves to physically or emotionally, when it's appropriate, clear those energies. The time isn't always appropriate to do it on the spot, but we have to find that. And I think that we are now in a place with a lot of work on the polyvagal system and also acknowledging what happens when we're living in a society where we're under extreme stress, but it's not as obvious as fight or flight. And a lot of people are really stuck in sympathetic dominance. So that's kind of a nutshell of the suppression of trauma. And the deepest layer, which is I think where we're going to be focused on today, is suppression of truth, because it's the hardest one to detect because it's all around us and we might not even notice. And there's two aspects of truth suppression. There's the lies we tell ourselves as individuals that we kind of make up along the way, or perhaps it's what our parents or a teacher told us and we allowed that narrative to continue. And it's also the collective lies. And a lot of those collective lies are guised as law and truth. That could be in the sciences, that could be in the religions, that could be in like the very mythos that we as a society believe, like our historical accounts of what we think is and isn't, or what we choose to magnify without taking a look and having blinders for all the other aspects, right? And so suppression of truth is so widespread. And because I have allowed myself deep research and learnings into some of the aspects of physics and other subjects, I've been able to also kind of take a step back and take a look at all of these different things. I'm pretty good at being sovereign minded. I have a lot to thank for. Well, we can get into that a little bit later. So yeah, that's the totality of social miasm theory: suppression of truth, trauma, and toxemia.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because, I think what you're about to touch on is, identity allegiances, and we're going to touch base on that a lot down the road. So I think you really did a great job at trying to summarize such a diverse and expansive topic with what you just described, with like examples of suppression that I'm sure our listeners are familiar with the fever, with the rash. So if I was going to try to speak for my skeptic friendly kind of listeners who are coming from this more conventional scientific background, who might not have done all the research and stuff that you have or some that I have, are there any like peer-reviewed studies or specific concrete case that there was like a Mayim-based thinking that led to like a documented improvement?
Are some papers that have employed homeopathy and double-blind experiences and placebos. More importantly, too, I think there's a lot of work that have been done with animals. There's a lot of homeopathic veterinarians, particularly for horses, but also dogs and sometimes cats, and usually those three. A lot of people put a lot of money and care into horses, right? And I think that's very valuable studies and anecdotal evidence that it's not just placebo, because they don't necessarily know what's going on when they're given a sugar pellet or water that has been infused with a particular frequency. And also, depending on the frequency, depends on whether or not it's beyond within Avogadro's number of molecular count, like whether or not there's a physical part within it or it's purely frequency. When it comes to acute issues, like poisons and that sort of thing, there is a molar count within there. But when you're working with a miasmatic, something that's very chronic, it's very deep in the body. And in order to go very deep like into the waters of the body and also the field that surrounds us, it requires pure frequency attunement. So we're working with something that's far outside Avogadro's number. But yes, there's some out there. Yeah, none on the top of my head. Sorry.
No, that's all good. I was just curious, and I'll have a lot of what we discuss. We'll make sure it's all linked in the show notes for folks who want to explore on their own. And I hear you, because we've already touched on how the allopathic model is limited, which we're going to touch base on in a question in a bit. So it would make sense that the study methods and methodologies that we have in this current paradigm would be limited in order to not be able to find.
Yeah. I think also it's important to say like where things get published. When we have a lot of the major journals that are agenda based, they're funded by pharmaceutical companies, et cetera. They're not going to be apt to publish something that turns their work on its head. So that's why you have to go and look at quote unquote alternative journals for this type of information, which are often more scientifically minded. The particular piece that I wrote for JSE, it's very rare for them to publish a theory piece. I was a rare exception. And it also comes with a few scientists, particularly there's a couple out of Europe and one in America of notoriety who have various backgrounds in different modalities who have also offered critique and commentary. But it's not, my particular piece has many, many scientific references. My original dissertation had 108 pages of references. I had to narrow that down drastically to fit into a journal and truncate the paper and leave out certain aspects that were considered appendage topics. But there is a lot of references available for people there.
Yes, I saw that when I was going through preparing for today's interview. So you've mentioned it a couple times, but in the paper you call it entropic cosmology. And this is what you challenge. And, again, this is your field, not me. I'm over here with the listeners here to learn. So this is that standard model and the materialist worldview behind modern science. And so we discussed that a little bit in the intro before we kicked off the interview. So folks know what materialist worldview is, because I think a lot of this folks might be so new to all these terms. Like even when you're just discussing what falls within the molecular criteria, like I haven't studied any of that. I just took biochem and, a couple science classes. So what do you see? Maybe you could break down a little bit more about this framework that you see as part of the problem for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So entropic cosmology, we'll get into the subtopics of that and what I consider like a synonym to entropic cosmology would be the death cult society, right? And so we live in a system that in order to talk about health, we have to talk about medicine. And what sits under medicine, right, is biochemistry, biophysics, cosmology, and physics. And what is underlining that is philosophy. So we really have to get to the brass tacks of the subject in order to understand how things have been built upon themselves. And we live in a society that is very analytic philosophy based. And there's many different schools of philosophy. We have various schools within the ancient traditions, and we have Eastern philosophy. In more modern times, we have continental philosophy. and perennial philosophy and different occult traditions as well that are more spiritual based. And within academia in the last 60 or so years, the agenda really started around the 70s and beyond. We have what is called analytic philosophy. And analytic philosophy is logic based. And I think logic is great. I think there's a time and place for logic. We obviously need it when we're programming computers. It's important that I think everyone take a basic logic class. It helps them to structure their own arguments. But inherent in analytic philosophy is logic, which is basically mathematizing through symbols various arguments to see if your argument is coherent in and of itself. It doesn't necessarily mean it's correct, but it means it is coherent for itself. And through analytic philosophy, we really get this nihilistic type belief systems where you get these philosophers that are no longer, they're kind of like, I call them armchair philosophers because they're no longer living and breathing their belief system. Their belief system is not, they're not going to be able to go outside and become a better human for that system and implement it. It's like they find some sort of statement and it can be as completely ridiculous, but they're able to argue that logically to a T, and therefore it works. But it's not something they live by. And a lot of it has become very ivory tower and completely disconnected to our physical bodies, to this planet. And it's honestly, from my perspective, has led us astray. And one of the directions it's led us astray is into the sciences and this idea of transhumanism and eugenics. And the philosophy itself is also very materialistic based. So when it comes to the way in which we think, are we, what came first, consciousness or materialism, right? There's this idea that materialism came first, and that's the main standard way of thinking, and that's how our sciences are based off of in our current system. And this idea, there was a philosopher named Bishop Berkeley who was an idealist. And when I use the word idealism versus materialism, idealism is the idea that consciousness came first. So don't think of like the way we anecdotally use the word ideal, right? So idealism is this belief consciousness comes first versus materialism. Materialism comes first. Bishop Berkeley was an idealist. I love to use this example. He would use a thought experiment. And one of them was, imagine a universe where nothing alive and conscious exists. It's just dead, inert rocks, right? Presupposing animism, right? And so you're thinking, okay, yeah, I have this inert world in my mind where, it's kind of just a bunch of rocks and whatnot. And the whole thing is you cannot imagine that because you are a conscious being. You are superseding that material reality. So that there's no way in which we can even theorize or philosophize materialism. And so to think such otherwise is counter to all of our experience as conscious beings. And within the analytic philosophy and materialist based world, when we start talking about the human body, they see things as very mechanistic. It's all very this like mechanical, everything are these parts. We just tweak one part and over here and another part over there, not recognizing that all of those parts are able to communicate with each other. And there's a new area of biology that I'm absolutely in love with that is an appendage within the frequency medicine world, and it's called quantum biology or quantum biological coherence. And it's this idea that our bodies are massive timescales from our external body all the way down into our atomic aspects of our body. We're looking at multiple 72 plus different time scales between the quantum and the macro, but they're all able to have full coherence with one another and communicate instantaneously with one another. And it's absolutely phenomenal when you start thinking of that. And so we are breaking out of this old paradigm system that's that's very mechanistic, but it is very slow to break out within academia. It used to be that our cutting edge work is coming out of academia and then it trickles into the rest of society. And we're not seeing that right now. We're seeing a bunch of renegade scientists that are doing incredible research that it's slowly trickling back into academia.
Yeah, good way to put it. The renegades are, the heterodox, the people who are breaking the paradigms. So, the big thing that I was just flipping to, I have Rupert Sheldrake's Science Set Free, which would be a great book to read because he talked about these 10 dogmas that exist in science or scientism in a 2013 TED Talk that got banned and then reinstated as pseudoscience. But one of the central doctrines to materialism is that matter is the only reality. Therefore, consciousness ought to not exist. And they believe that matter is unconscious. They believe nature is purposeless, which just sounds illogical. Like it just doesn't even make sense. Plus, like you said, it's so nihilistic. That's when I was like touched in the atheistic sphere for like a second. I was like, nah, dog, this is not my realm of consciousness. This is like this. I can't. So I just wanted to touch base on that for some of my folks who might be interested to dive a little deeper into how Rupert Sheldrake challenges these paradigms, because again, he is also, he's not a crank. He's someone who went to Cambridge University. You're not a crank. Like people want to, ad hominem attack before calming down their nervous system and trying to think outside of the box for a second, because it's really fun and that's really how we problem solve. So thanks for taking the time to break that down, because you're right about peeling back the layers. And there's so much that we build upon in the world of science and research, like germ theory, for example, Louis Pasteur's experiments. We've like built upon those instead of going back and looking at like with fresh eyes and the information we have now in 2025 compared to what small sphere of knowledge he was working with. And I'm sure you can agree about how germ theory has led us astray as well. And that's kind of what we're hoping to touch base on. Do you want to add anything before we move on to the medicine and meeting, kind of the suppression of disease? Because I'd love to hear like what true healing system would look like in your kind of idea.
Yeah, I'll make a comment before we go into suppression further. So first, Rupert Sheldrake, big props. I borrow on his morphogenic field theory, as we are all antennas and receivers, and it's our entire field. It's within our DNA, our mitochondria. We're electrical beings, and that's a whole subject in and of itself. And he's an incredible biologist. He's done some really famous experiments that were very involved. And he received a lot of ad hominem attacks for his work. Honestly, at this point, whenever someone starts receiving major outlandish criticisms that go beyond the research and into a personal attack, I feel like someone is onto something. Not only are they instigating into the individual like some sort of part of themselves, like, oh, the truth is starting to well up, like suppress, like attack. Um, but yeah, there's something to be said there. And with I just want to also go a little bit further into the death cult component as well. So when I call it the death cult or the entropic cosmology, obviously we have this belief that the universe, we're taught that the universe has a tendency towards entropy and chaos, and that eventually this entire universe is going to die of this heat death, and it's all chaos and disorder. But when you look further into our physics and you start to recognize that it's the opposite, it's incredibly ordered. And the universe is ordering itself and it's structuring itself and it's layers and layers of order. Now, this order is dynamic, right? That's what homeostasis is. It's dynamic balance. But there's going to be, when something is dynamic and moving, there's obviously going to be moments of chaos before a higher order receives itself. I mean, when you look at the chrysalis of a caterpillar, for example, that turns into a butterfly, there's destruction there, right? That Shiva aspect is absolutely necessary for the higher orders of order. So it's not always going to be perfectly ordered and structured, but the universe is ordering itself. There has been some mapping that has been done by the Resonance Science Foundation and other groups. And there's a lot of great unified physics models that are speaking of different aspects of something similar, from Resonance Science Foundation with Nassim Haramein's work, the holofractogenic theory that was first implemented by David Bohm, the electric universe theory as well, and the Thunderbolt scientists that look at the electrical aspects, whereas most people are focusing more on the gravitic aspects of how things work. But when you look at the standard model has massive incompatible mathematics between this with the small and with the large. Like, it does not add up. It's not coherent. It's completely disjointed. For anyone who's willing to take that direction and really learn the math and the physics behind the standard model, it is a big old mess. I think there's something to be gleaned from it, particularly when you go into the quantum theories. But the quantum theories are much more eloquent, and they line up with the unified traditions. But going back to this whole truth component and the death cult, like, we have been bred to believe that everything is disorganized and entropy and chaos, and there's all this waste. And when you look at in what's going on in physics, we used to have the ether, which was this sort of structured plasma-like world. And Einstein allowed for mathematics that didn't need to use the active vacuum or the ether. And so we called it a vacuum, and as though it was like inert and nothing. But since the 1990s, with the Casimir plate experiments, we've known that quote, empty active vacuum has infinite energy density. It's perfectly quantized. It's infinite. And so, yes, you can probably extract from that, the electrons that come into our universe are called positrons in force space or in the active vacuum, right? That's like the inversion of our universe into that empty nothingness. And we won't go into, COP, greater than one system technologies, also known as free energy or over unity. But that's another aspect of suppression that they, right, like the death cults of the world that control the narrative, don't want us to know about and learn about, at least yet. And so when we start to recognize that we're not, the energy is being recirculated in and out of the active vacuum, right? It's not ever completely lost. It's just being transmuted and rebirthed. And we ourselves are aspects of nature. That it's another aspect is like, oh, humans, like, we got kicked out of the garden, in our little, speaking of like stories we tell ourselves, right? Like, here's this Garden of Eden story, and there's so many layers and levels in which to interpret it, right? But when we're looking at it from this idea that we were kicked out of this garden, regardless of whether or not you take that literally or it's just like a metaphorical story, it's kind of ridiculous, because as though we're separate from nature, like, we are also aspects of nature, right? Are we living in balance with our surroundings? Like, absolutely. There's a lot to be improved upon, but we're still, you can't kick us out of the garden. Like, we're the garden, we're an inherent part of that garden. We have to learn how to work with our surroundings and recognize that we're all connected.
Mm. Yeah. Have you heard of panpsychism?
A little bit. Explain
Yeah.
more.
Well, I can barely do that. I'm just starting to read a book about by Dr. David Skirbina, which has someone who's been dragged through the mud for his anti-Semitic viewpoint. So again, when someone gets labeled, I'm always interested to hear what they have to say. Doesn't mean that I condone everything that comes out of their mouth. But yeah, he's got his background in philosophy and talks about panpsychism being one of the oldest kind of philosophies or naturalistic way to view things. And, one of the things he said, it kind of goes back to what you were saying about idealism versus materialism and about evolution, because if evolution theory is correct, then we were, like you said, there was a time where there was no conscious living things. And all of a sudden, then life evolved in this universe. And so the problem is, how did mind emerge from non-mind? So if there were non-thinking, non-conscious? How did the mother and father birth a conscious thinking, or was it always there? As you were saying, as consciousness has always been there. And so that's a question that panpsychism challenges, and that can even go into the hot debate of abortion, which is something that I've been thinking a lot about. Like, when does that fetus become a viable life? Because I think if life starts at conception, then you know what I mean? And not to bring up the topic, but it's just like the same concept of like, when do you draw the line of when now that fetus is an actual baby and has rights? And that's always been fascinating to me from a philosophical standpoint. And so I just wanted to touch on just panpsychism is kind of like animism, but not. And I can't speak much more to it because I'm literally only in chapter 3 of the book, but I will bring on Scribina to break it down more. But I thought it might be something that you could circle around because of all your vast knowledge. They might be able to pick and choose things that you really like about that. And so I just appreciate that because it's stuff that I've been trying to tap back into, breaking out of Abrahamic supremacy and not like wanting to evolve in my spirituality, but not do something from the Middle East that has nothing to do. Like, I'm 100% European and Welsh and Celtic. So I'm trying to tap into what we do know from my past, which has been so erased so much due to the Abrahamic supremacy, which is sad. But a lot of that is tapping back into the ancestors, back into the circle, the wheel of life, and just being one with nature. And that's why I love gardening and homesteading and trying to, give offerings to the spirits of the land and just opening up my heart to that sort of stuff, even if it feels kind of woo woo. And so I did a land offering around the autumn equinox and right by my pond. Okay. I set up all sorts of littles, like I collect, I had a little vase and some Herkimer diamonds and a lot of flowers. And I said something, and to my ancestors, to the unseen spirits. And the next day, this huge bullfrog, I'm talking as big as my hand, was in my kitchen hanging out. And I was like, oh my gosh, like it was like the land speaking back to me. I've lived here 3 years and a frog, he must have come in through the donkey door. I have no idea. So it was like so exciting for me to kind of see that. I just felt super touched. And so I just wanted to tap into that. I do think there's so much more out there that materialism can take away from us. And that's part of kind of healing us as a society is understanding that we are electric beings and there's so much more that we don't see out there. And it can be as simple as what you can see, which is going outside in nature and just trying to be more in connection with the land and just trying to grow food is not easy. Like, we have not had success in our garden. So it's teaching me a lot and resilience too, like trying to work with nature, be one with it so I can, be a team and get strong yield out of the land. What does it look like if we live in a suppressed state? Like, what does that look like in everyday life? You want to break that down a little more for us?
Yeah, let me respond to both your comments and questions. So, absolutely, it's funny because in analytic philosophy, the bridge between the material and the conscious is kind of brushed over. They have a term called epiphenomenalism. And that's where like consciousness magically just springs into being after like however long of eons you just have materialism. And they're like, oh, yes, yes, epiphenomenalism, epiphenomenalism. And then they just brush over it. And it's kind of like how so much is brushed over with the placebo effect, right? In medicine. I'm like, all is mind. I'm like, when are we going to talk? Is there a class on placebo? Because, it just seems like that's like pretty much everything that I'm being taught in here. There's a lot of this smoke and mirrors in quote unquote scientism that, and analytic philosophy for that matter, that they just give it a word and it sounds rather fancy. And then that's the end of it. And then there's no conversation about it. And anyone who asks the question of dares to ask gets criticized for just not getting it, right? And so, yeah, so it's just funny that you mentioned that because there was this moment when I was in high school. I was in a French class of all things, and that's where I was first introduced to animism and the concept of animism. And I remember everyone in the class thinking so funny, like some of these cultures that were, speak French that believe in animism and that everything has a life to it. And I remember everyone was laughing and I was like, well, I feel like there's something to be said there because there is some sort of self-preservation, sentience. Like, are they self-aware and highly conscious? Like, not like us. But even within humans, there's a huge variation of people being aware and people being robotic. that self-awareness I'm finding more and more is lacking in a large subset of our population. But I mean, the table knows to remain a table, the atoms, the way in which they've bonded, be it covalent or ionizing, depending on what you're looking at, uh, it knows it has this self-preservation to maintain itself. And on some minute aspect, there's a sentience. Every individual cell knows like when to sort of what to create, how to preserve itself, when to commit suicide, apoptosis. It knows when to move towards the food and away from the toxemia. There's some level of of knowingness that we can see stacked upon itself to the global universal consciousness and mind. And for anyone who's gone into Hermetic philosophy and just the studies of esotericism also can, knows, according to Hermes Trismegistus and others, like all is mentalism, all is mind. Like that's all it is. Everything else is a subset of our imaginations, and be that the universal and beyond cosmic imagination of the universe wanting to, splitting itself and continually splitting itself and creating itself so that it could have that reflection of awareness. But we've created everything around us, so to speak, right? And we can see that in this simple double slit experiment, right? Whatever the observer anticipates is what will happen. Like that should tell us something, right? So again, when we're a social species, we are living in the product of our creation on this planet, both literally and subtly. And so, people who maintain a victim-based mentality are always going to find an aggressor in their life of some sort that they're going to continually bump up against, right? If you're living on one extreme of a pendulum, you're going to find that other pendulum as well. And sometimes people will literally yo-yo themselves in between the pendulum, or they'll find that equal and opposite. I think Carl Jung called that an antidromia, when the opposite sort of becomes itself, but it also has that Hegelian aspect of like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Now, in his philosophy and work, it was the idea that like you bring the two together and they kind of level up, right? Sort of like that Heros, Gamos, like masculine energy, feminine energy leveling into it. But you can also interpret it as like you are the other side of that conscious experience in which you're having. So, if any of your viewers are rubbing up against something over and over and over again, and then kind of like pushing the blame out, pushing the blame in, the real magic is that alchemical transmutation where you take a look at it like it's a mirror and you recognize, and maybe you stop judging and you start accepting, like not accepting like, oh, I'll let this, asshole, take over my life, but more of like accepting like, wow, like I am in part and parcel to this experience. Like, what can I do in myself to release this sort of existential kink to continually rub up against something?
So really, I was just curious, and you kind of just talked about it in a way about someone who might be stuck in the victim mindset. Like what does it look like to live every day in a suppressed state? So I was just trying to think about like other biomarkers, case examples, anything like that you could try to explain of what it looks like in every day, or like what would it mean to live unsuppressed? Like what does either example look like?
Great question. So in homeopathy, when we're discussing the miasms and the roughly 5 tract miasms, the first and the last of the miasms is called the psoric miasm, like think psoriasis or eczema. And that's considered, according to Samuel Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy, like it's like the 1,000-headed monster, because it's from that all things come after that. And homeopathy has both a terrain and germ component. And from its perspective, it's both, and they work together. And so when the truth has been suppressed and it turns into a traumatic component where there's trauma within that individual, eventually their vitals are low enough where a germ that they maybe have encountered for a millennia and has never affected them is able to come into their being. And at first it's going to be a serious acute illness, right? And the individual is probably not going to procreate. They're probably going to die. But over time, the humans figure out how to adapt with that specific germ. And once they're able to adapt with that germ where they have like a low level chronic component versus an acute and die component to it, they start to procreate. And that's how the miasm springs into existence and a specific pattern of disease. So the 5 miasms, and just bear with the words because they're not very euphemistic. So the first miasm is soric. The second one is psychotic, but it's spelt with an SYC for anyone who wants to look it up. Third is syphilitic. Fourth is tubercular. Fifth is cancer. And they all have certain predispositions. The first being the contagion. So for soric, it was Mycoplasma lepraceae was considered the first initiation. Now, this one is harder to track because it's so ancient. This is a very, very ancient miasm. And it seems as though we know from looking at historical accounts, leprosy used to be a very serious situation on this planet. There were whole leprosy colonies. It was considered highly contagious. You were definitely outcasted. It was considered you had done something very immoral or wrong, which might be the case, like with the emotional component, or it could just be something you inherited and then you encountered toxemia or stress, right? But mankind could have been wiped off the face of this earth with leprosy, but we figured out a way to adapt. And after that adaptation sprung the next 2 miasms. Psychotic was the original influence was gonorrhea. Now, you can be psychotically miasmatic and have never experienced gonorrhea in this life. I just want to be very clear on that because it's a miasm. It's not an acute disease necessarily, but its origin comes from a germ that what does gonorrhea do? And gonorrhea-like symptoms of other things. It grows outward. It's like an outward expansion. So think of a figwort. Almost all of us are at least trimiasmatic. I've had a figwort before. That means I have dormant psychotic miasm somewhere in my system. Some ancestor somewhere at some point had gonorrhea and survived and procreated. And so you have like a lot of CEO types, athletes are very psychotic in their miasmatic state because it's go, 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 out, out, out. You can almost think of it like the Pitta state in Ayurveda or the mesodermal state in like Western physiology. It's that athletic type being. They're very outward and expansive. And a lot of their diseases are going to be overgrowth, right? A benign tumor, for example, right? Whereas the syphilitic component is very destructive and it goes inward. So doesn't mean you have syphilis if you're syphilitically predispositioned. It does mean that if you come across it in this life, you're more likely to catch it. But it doesn't necessarily mean you've ever had it or your parents have had it. It could be dormant for so many years, and all miasms can be dormant or active. Most of them are deep, deep inside our constitution. We can only treat and work with what's on the surface, right? Even if you know, like, oh, I know I've got syphilitic in my system. If you're showing signs of psychotic or soric, that's what you need to work on first, right? There's an order of operations, and you can only offer what is revealing itself, right? And so that's like the positive aspect of like when a pattern of disease wells to the surface and you're dealing with something, like you can congratulate yourself, wow, like something's revealed itself as an opportunity for me to work with. And so think of like a planter's wart for the syphilitic miasmatic. But there's a whole component of, especially when someone's actively miasmatic, what that would look like for syphilitic, right? Like even the vocations they would take, like surgeons, piercers, butchers, like that is quintessential syphilitic type vocations that would light somebody up who has that predisposition, right? And none of this is a judgmental component. Like I think planet Earth, the way civilization has evolved has ensured that no society or group is left behind with miasmatic predispositions, not to mention the fact that we are all survivors from like the Younger Dryas and the Great Deluge and coming out of major cataclysms where we've had memory suppression and then remembering. Like we have gone so deep into suppression of trauma and toxemia. So it's not a surprise that we're compounded miasmatically as a species. But the tubercular is the same way. Mycoplasma tuberculosis. I did predict that the tubercular and the cancer miasm were going to skyrocket after COVID due to different components of in which the orthodoxy through all the major media outlets were kind of pushing at people. I'm like, that's going to skyrocket. That's going to skyrocket. And it has. But the tubercular people have a very specific physical disposition. I can tell by looking at someone if they were born with the tubercular miasm on top. They're going to be more predispositioned to issues within like the lungs and that sort of component. They also have a very freedom oriented mindset, right? They like open air, freedom. They don't like constriction. So that was definitely a group of people they had to try and figure out like how to wrangle with the mind control components during the COVID times. And then the cancer aspects as well have a very specific component. And with cancer, there's a few different parasitic contagion, but they are also finding that within cancer patients, particularly those that have what would be considered miasmatic cancer, there's absolutely some type of parasitic component that goes along with that as well. And there's a few of them that have been mapped depending on the type of cancer. So that's, again, why detoxing from parasites is so important. And in social miasm theory, I do talk a lot about neuroparasitology. And that is the effect of parasites on our neural component and how we think, what we preference as individuals, our choices in food, our choices in partners, what we like to do and don't do. And when anyone who's had a major parasite detox realizes it's also a very cathartic emotional detox, because there are like funguses, bacteria, amoebas, helminths, the worms, they have a grip on our enteric nervous system as well as our neurological system. And when they die off, it feels like we're dying off. Like there's a component of emotional outbursts and experiences that we detox. But the further you go back in time, the further you recognize that neuroparasitology and demonology are almost one and the same. They were just using a different language because they didn't have a microscope, but they knew that there was some sort of entity connection. And in some, not all, but in some miasmatic lineages of individuals, you will find there is some sort of spiritual or entity component. We find this a lot in like alcoholics, for example, right? Like they're drunk and their eyes almost shift and change a little bit. And they take on this aggressor persona that perhaps their father or grandfather or someone else in their lineage also had. And so we can see all of these compounding together and creating different personality types.
Ooh, you just covered so much ground in a short time. That's why I was so excited to get you on the podcast, because of how eloquent and articulate you are about just breaking down the 5 miasms in a way that someone like me or the listeners can comprehend and understand. And it can be, like you said, kind of getting caught up in the names like tuberculosis, syphilis. Whoa, just the ick factor that can come around that is interesting, because that's, again, part of that evolution of thought that has been kind of the labels and the identity that can be lumped into that and keep us from actually exploring the concepts themselves. So, Daniel Dennett, who is a part of that new atheist circle that we might have some qualms with, but I did enjoy his book, which talks about just religion as he talks about parasites of the mind, and part of that book is what I wanted to bring him up. And he says that the ideas spread and survive, not necessarily because they're true. And I think that you're actually talking about a real parasite, and I agree with that idea. I think he's talking about more about there's a way to hijack human psychology, whether that's, biological parasites, which that happens in rats. A parasite can come and lead them to their death of going to cats or something like that. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Toxoplasma.
Yes. So, we see that in biological parasites, but there's other ways they can just exploit fears, hopes, moral impulses, social pressors. So I find that really fascinating. And this is a total tangent, like a quick research. Okay, here it is. Okay, so so now we're going Epstein files real quick. So Leslie Wexner, who is deeply connected to Epstein, as I'm sure you know. I'm not sure if my listeners know too much about that. But I was just watching a Whitney Webb interview. Have you read her books, One Nation Under Blackmail, Volume 1 and 2?
I have not read Whitney's books, but I'm familiar with her. She's a
Her
great
work.
journalist.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So she mentioned in an interview that I just saw that Leslie Wexner described himself of having a kind of Dybbuk spirit. It's spelled Dybbuk, and it is, in Judaism, and it's a kind of demon in Jewish folklore. And he actually spoke to it in like a Newsweek or very public interview. And he said that it troubles him, is something he was saying. And I found I wanted to bring that up because I think sex trafficking and some of these abuses that are so beyond our comprehension I'm like, are they even human? As you want to ask, like, how are people so dark and to do this? And we talk about the concept of evil in philosophy too, as well, and so I'd love with this theory of what do you call it? Neuroparasitology.
Neuroparasitology.
That's it. Neuroparasitology. I think you're touching on something that literally Leslie Wexner could even have been confessing to, is something within our bodies. Or RFK-J gets made fun of all the time. I've never dug into this. The brainworm comment that he made. So you want to touch on some of that stuff before we move on?
Sure. It's interesting with Bobby's comment, because I remember years and years ago, right? He's no longer a part of Children's Health Defense, but I'm a big fan of it. And him and his team have litigated against environmental atrocities, as well as like helping children who have been toxified and poisoned. And he was doing an interview, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, with someone who was talking about the problems within the adjuvants of vaccines and the side effects that they cause, and is multitudinous. But one of the things they mentioned, and I think it's called dystonia off the top of my head, is the issue with his voice, right? And they mentioned how that's a common side effect of the flu vaccine. And it used to be with thimerosal, now it's with aluminum, that attenuate the virus, the adjuvant. And there was like this aha moment that he had, because he used to take vaccines, before he started diving into the research. And he used to be a proponent, because that's just what we're taught, like, go take your vaccine. You just like assume, that people know what they're talking about when they speak with conviction. And so it's interesting that he mentioned that there was potentially a brain parasite causing it, which is also possible, because that's another potential etiology for that type of condition. But it's just funny that he mentioned that, because I was like, but you don't actually know where yours comes from. It could have been from that vaccine that but he perhaps didn't want to address that and, stir the pot too strongly up front. Because, speaking of like many politicians, they have a blackmailing, through APAC and other sources, like, I'm sure Mossad has the dirt on everybody and anybody who wants to, make it big in some aspect of their life. And I just don't know why most people can be like, take the approach of, so what? You like know that I, cheated on this person when I was married to them or whatever. Just own it. Like, own your mistakes. Like, we should all try not to do such things, right? Obviously, and live as in much truth as possible. But for anyone who has had experiences, particularly in the past, that they're not happy and proud about, it's not doesn't call for all of us to come clean on social media or whatever. But if you're trying to get into politics or something, just own it. If there's nothing to blackmail you against, and you don't have to worry about that sort of thing. But so many people have been, badgered into the honeypot, and they're ashamed of it. And, one of the biggest concerns that people have is to be outcasted. And perhaps that's because we all have, or at least many of us have had ancestors that were outcasted at some shape or time due to some physical or mental condition or choice that they've had, and so we carry that in our waters, and it's time that we like really redefine ourselves. But I do think that there are a number of people, they tend to find themselves in places of power on this planet. They have like that megalomaniac aspect to themselves that are being propelled by like a succubus, be that a parasite or a fungus, which I think is very extensive. I have a private practice, and I use frequency medicine technology remotely with hair samples and whatnot to scan people. And first world countries have as many parasites as third world countries, particularly in terms of worms. We have the Ascari lumbricoids. They get this big. They're in the guts of a lot of people. I mean, they've been in my gut, like unsavory sushi choices has caused that in myself as well. And I've had to detox out of it. Some people are more prone to others. But fungus is an even more serious one because it can get into the brain and it's everywhere, right? It's like within every aspect of your system. Bacteria can take over different organ systems and cause like serious anger in your liver. Like, I'm so angry, I don't know why, and like, well, maybe a good liver detox might help with that. But, some people have, and again, this is also them basing their assumption that humans are separate from nature, that we're not all connected in this universe. And they have this assumption and then they act accordingly. And they are so isolated and separated because they're living within a worldview that offers false suppositions. And so they end up getting propelled by something that's transhumanistic in an artificial sense, like artificially transhumanistic versus us evolving into Homo spiritus and naturally evolving. Like whichever, like we as humans are not at the apex of our evolution. We have so much further to go. And if we allow that organic evolution a chance, I guarantee there is no glass ceiling to what we're capable of. It's just going to take time. Right? It might just be a longer path up the mountain, but we will continue to ascend up that mountain. People who are, it's like they're in a hurry, like I gotta get as far as I can in this life. And then they fear death and they fear their shadow because they're not looking at the very aspects of the things they need to take a look at. And so, they almost get propelled by this succubus type energy, either be it parasitic from the inside or just like in morphogenic resonance. It's some sort of receiver that's emitting to them these frequencies, right? We know that you can petrodyne messages on radio waves, off delta wave radiation that's coming from people's phones, from the computer screens, from the television. These are technologies and patents that we've known about since the 1980s.
Yep.
So this is a thing that people need to be hyper vigilant of and aware of and constantly questioning like where the impetus is underneath their motive. Now, with the 5 miasmatic states, there are hundreds of remedies for each one, depending on every individual constitution, right? That's what makes homeopathy so challenging. It's like, I know there's a remedy out there somewhere for an individual, but I might not be able to find it, right? But so it's none of it is like cookie cutter. It's very individualized, but each of those constitutional types within the miasmatic, there is an impetus and a drive behind what it is they do and why they do it. And that can be also seen behind people and their motivations in the world at large. Like, what's my purpose for why I'm doing it? Am I doing it so that everyone can congratulate me and pat me on the back and I can feel like I'm super cool? Or is it because I really, truly care about this subject and I really want to help humanity, and sometimes it's a little bit of both, but like, where is that final and foundation and where does it come from? And that goes too with like people who are triggered, right? Like we just talked about we just use some nasty words, like no one wants to take a look at STDs. We just shun from them regardless of whether or not we've experienced one or not, it's just like, ooh, but it's like, well, it's a part of humanity's shadow, and it's a part of, there's a lot that is a part of humanity's shadow. And if we can't take a look at the social shadow, it's even harder to take a look at our own shadow. And so the more we do our work as individuals, whatever type of shadow work that looks like, every individual is going to have a different path. The more as a collective we transform. We're so busy like pointing at the mirror, like you fix this, like, our politicians or whatever, everything is like their fault. And it's like, no, like they're an outward manifestation of everything that's happened up to that point, including who we are within ourselves. And as soon as we stop headbutting our head against the wall and we just start to actually take a moment, take a breath, and take a good look at it, we recognize how much there is that we can improve in ourselves, and our world around us will start to transform. And if everybody did that, then the collective world will start to transform.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because what you're touching on is like our responsibility, kind of solution oriented thinking. And you, the major theme of the conversation was that humanity has constructed this false reality. And therefore, we co created these social miasms. And so, how to get out is channeling our own personal sovereignty, doing our own shadow work, as you said. And I'm sure there's specific interventions like practices that you could recommend. And we've gone over an hour. And so I appreciate that you kind of just touched base on some of the last questions. I do want to touch on a little bit of the collective delusion. And because we were just kind of talking about that, whether that's from internal or external, and how COVID was a catalyst for that. I think because COVID was a really big wake up for a lot of folks. I mean, some folks went like it's like people got radicalized either way. They either became the worshipers of vaccine and authority and scientism, or they were like me and you who were like, wait a minute, something smells off. This is authoritarian. This is totalitarian kind of infrastructure and kind of digging deeper. So can you kind of touch base on a little bit of that as we close down the interview?
Yeah. So with the collective psychosis component, which I believe we experienced during COVID times, it's not the first time humanity has experienced something like this, right? I mean, look at Nazi Germany. Take a look at the whole witch hunt throughout Europe. Barely left any women alive in some villages. Everyone is ratting on everybody else as being allegedly a witch, that the church then burned at the stake. We've seen this throughout time, and Carl Jung and has done an excellent job too of tracking this information. And I use some of his research and quotations in my book or in my paper, as well as Dostoevsky. He has a book called Demons. And he talks about how this like collective psychosis that can propel us forward and cause more harm than any natural disaster. And it's harm that we do unto ourselves. He considered it to be an aspect of demonology. And it really takes a look too of like where our identity allegiance is and how deep that runs. So many people are still running on pre-programmed identity allegiance that filters every aspect of their being and thought. They don't even recognize that it's a filter because it's always been there. And, we can see that as deeply as, the suppression of the divine feminine for thousands of years. We see how in our very language and how we word things, like take the word history, for example, it's his story. And we just presuppose, well, that's just the way the language is, or the way in which we use the chronology of languages or certain subsets. And this isn't just in English, this is in every language that we have. We see this prioritization of the masculine and the importance of masculine type ideals, even if it's a female doing those masculine things, is far more important than rearing children, for example. And when we take a look at the ancient civilizations that we now know were matriarchal based, they worshipped the divine feminine and the divine creatrix. They worshipped Gaia and nature. And so a lot of these pre-Abrahamic traditions, some of them which were religions, some of them were more spiritual shamanic beliefs, but they're the groups of people that brought us civilization, our earlier languages, and megalithic structures that we cannot recreate today. And we look at them and we're like, oh, how quaint those fertility cults. Like, not too much to look at there. I'm like, they brought us agriculture and everything that we know of today. How can we completely dismiss these groups? And so that's just one example that runs really deep, of these identity allegiances. A lot of people will see this in in religion, right? the religion they brought up with, even if they end up rebelling against it later, it's like they're in opposition to the very thing they're rebelling against. So they're still in the domain of that pendulum and perspective, right? I saw this with my father. I feel like I was very fortunate to be raised by a very humanistic and intelligent atheist. And my father's from the Great Generation, so he was rebelling very much against the Catholic state. And I didn't see, everything made sense as an atheist growing up. I considered myself one. I started having experiences that required me to tweak my web of beliefs. So I was like, I can no longer live within this web of beliefs. There's something very off about it. But I began to see how, when you live in like Abrahamic Christendom, right? And I'm talking about like the three major religions sort of in that viewpoint of like this type of like Judeo-Christian, like pie in the sky type God. And you rebel against it. The natural like antithesis of God, is no God, right? And so you think you're rebelling and you're freeing yourself from the confines of this perspective, but you're just the tails of the heads of one coin. And there's so many other coins in the market, right? And so that's where I became my own aspect of spirituality and my own subjective truth that aligns with the greater objectivity of what's going on. I think that there is, the God, source creator, that, the great perpetuator that has this cosmic consciousness, and we're all evolving and refining ourselves to align with the higher and higher perspectives that's in this greater coherent alignment. But we're all coming from a different angle and perspective. So we're going to also have our own truths, right? With like a lowercase t. And I think that's perfectly acceptable because we're learning through others. Like I can see in my friends that did birthright and were, born, with Judaism as their family religion. I have some Judaistic blood as well. I wasn't raised that way. And I'm a bit of a mutt for that matter. But the point is, it's easier when you're looking from the outside to see, wow, like that's some really strong identity allegiance, like you think that they're free beings with how they act, but when it comes to like one specific subject that strikes a dissonant chord, immediately, there's like they're holding to it like it's their last stronghold. And it's just like we can love and honor all of these traditions. We don't have to have a death grip on it that to define ourselves. Like if we all learn to stand sovereignly on our own and to analyze like the aspects of ourself that are not aligned and coherent with what seems to be going on, and always to have an open mind, be willing to, not pendulum swing right and left willy-nilly, but being willing to hold strong on our feet, but be willing to question what we thought we knew, I think is a very, very healthy form of skepticism that we should all have, so that we are learning how to be sovereign. And we're all going to have different aspects of our strengths and weaknesses in sovereignty. I have a whole side subject called the 7 Seals of Sovereignty that really does get into that. But that's, I think, what's most important. And that's what really the essence is, the suppression of truth is, our bodies keep score. Our bodies know the truth, things that are not in our conscious field that we're aware of and self-aware of. There's some aspect in our field, in our cytoplasm, in the waters of our body that have that deep awareness. And if we're allowing ourselves to just honor that and listen and feel if something just doesn't quite feel right, and not just be automatically reactive. And again, if we want to take a look at the shadows of our collective consciousness, we have to start with the shadows of ourselves, because they're going to be a lot easier to deal with than the collective shadows. But that goes along with like what you mentioned with the trafficking and all of these things. Like there are people that are so incredibly like actively miasmatic in the deepest and darkest aspects of each of those miasms, right? And they have gone so deep and dark, and they're so detached. And I'm sure at this point, they feel like there's no way in which they can rectify themselves, and there's only one direction. They have, if they only allowed themselves that moment to like seek within their hearts, I feel like there's no one that is completely lost. I feel like everybody can be healed. But when you take a look at some of the psychopaths of the world, I mean, they are the most miasmatic. So why are we, taking orders from them and treating them like they're our saviors when they have their own serious problems as well?
Yeah, for real. And I really appreciate the concept of like just tapping into and how to become more sovereign. And I think that might be an unfamiliar word, but in regards to nutrition, fitness, we always talk about bioindividuality and how important that is when we're seeking solutions. And that's so much of what summarizes this whole conversation about this. There's a balance between the collective and individuals, and the bioindividualization is basically the same thing as finding your own sovereignty. So when I'm a coach, I can't make these blanket statement recommendations, and that's the big issue in the fitness industry. I think most of it is a complete scam, because meaning a lot of the ability to change your body is a lot of that's based in genetics. So you see a bodybuilder and they're like, well, they were doing performance enhancement drugs, which allowed them to surpass their genetics to do that. So it's just kind of funny when you really look at the prevalence of performance enhancement drugs or other biohacking like peptides, which I'm not so much against, but they still just change the overall sphere, and you're playing with outside factors that aren't so well spoken of when you're kind of promoting yourself in the fitness industry. And so I really appreciate what you said about staying open-minded, and that's kind of what I've been on this whole journey. If you listen to back in season 2, I'm so much of a different person. I almost cringe listening to how I was just, and that's not fair, but like I saw a quote that said, if you're not embarrassed about who you were last year, then you're probably not growing enough. And I was like, oh, okay, relief. Then I guess I'm doing, I'm on the right track. And of course, I'm not embarrassed of everything, but, I definitely look back at and can see, and again, that's the journey of my own susceptibilities, my own vulnerabilities, which I was talking to you about prior to recording, on what leads me to these, which would probably be my, and in this frame of thinking, that would be my miasms, right? Is basically that would be the other word. Like, what are my susceptibilities? That would also be, how would you phrase that in the social miasm theory? Like, which
Yeah.
miasm I have on top or whatever?
I would say susceptibility is a great word for that, because that would be like a sub classification within the larger group. So yeah, I mean, we're all miasmatic, active and or dormant, but it's more of the susceptibility and the impetus for sure.
Mm. And COVID as a catalyst, the other thing that it really brought to my awareness was the terrain theory, is because of how different people's reactions were to the the SARS, to whatever we want to call it. It really brought out your susceptibilities. Like, my husband has issues with lungs and breathing, so he got pneumonia afterwards. And really, whenever he gets sick, he'll always have a lingering cough. And for me, it brought out my susceptibilities, which were gut health and brain fog. And I thought that was so interesting, depending on who you were and the state of like your overall terrain, and maybe the miasms, is how COVID kind of brought those things out of you. Does that make sense? As how COVID was a catalyst for some of us who might not have ever thought outside of the germ theory worldview? It helped me kind of break out of that, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think COVID or whatever it was that caused the sickness that a lot of people got at that time, and I think that's multifaceted too, because there was a psychological component, but there's also a very real physical component that affected a lot of people, and it's gonna different people's different predisposition, right, which is their different miasmatic states and their unique essence of self that they inherited through both their mother's line, their father's line, and what they've done in this particular lifetime is going to reveal the different weaknesses and the different strengths, for that matter, as well. And also importantly was the ways in which, like, the psychology of how the media purported and pushed forward. Like, for example, it was like, go out and, wear a mask for others. Like, it's not just for you, it's for others. And, get vaccinated for others. Like, that's very much like within the cancer miasmatic component, because like people who are miasmatic with cancer on top have this idea that they have to like help everybody else. They're there for everybody else, but they're not there for themselves, until all of a sudden it's revealed that they've got stage 4 cancer or something like that. And so I'm like, wow, that's really interesting. And There was this whole component of every different miasmatic state. There was like a little something there with the psychology of how they worded it, where it struck a chord with so many different people, which is why there were so many different groups of people within every state, that even though there's like a freedom element, there's also this like conditioned element. And if people aren't aware that they're going to be manipulated, they were psychologically manipulated, and it was attuned specifically for them to receive that message, to like take the bait.
Yeah, I was just watching a video on the Corbett Report. Do you watch James Corbett at all, or have you heard of him?
I've heard
He
of him.
Yeah, his research, he's well-known independent researcher. So he was just talking about the manufacturing of consent and the government behavioral engineering, and he had an expert on that was specifically talking about how it was done in Canada, but also talking about the research done in the UK, which I touched on slightly in a podcast. It's called it's like nudging, but it's called S. There's like, okay, I'm trying to find it in the interview right here, but I'll leave a note in for the podcast listeners, but it's SPI-B, which basically stands for how the scientific research on to get the adherence to the COVID-19 preventative measures in young people. And so there was literal behavioral research and scientists, like you were just saying, that I can show in the reports that have been released from the UK and Canada, how they were nudging and psychologically manipulating and manufacturing consent during this time, which I couldn't have put to words what was going on, but I knew in my sovereign heart of hearts that what was going on was super suspect. And I'm still glad that I stood strong during those times. And you're one of the few folks that I saw in all of our friend circles. Like a lot of people fell for it, and it was really difficult time. And it's still, folks are very judgmental about it now, which I find sad. So in closing down, because I could talk to you all day, I'm sure you've got some things to do. Is there something that you want to end, like to leave the listeners with on one shift on how they could view illness or maybe truth itself that, what would that be?
A couple things. One, so the essence of social miasm theory has a lot to do with pathogenesis, meaning origin of disease. And Hahnemann was on to that as well. He did not have the knowledge and access to what we have now. So he couldn't go far enough back in history, right? Whereas now we have all this information from pre and immediately post Diluvian civilizations, potentially even as far back as Atlantis, as more and more people are opening up these cavities within their own memories. And then we're finding these ancient megalithic sites like underwater, not to mention the history of Dwarka in India, which there's two ancient civilizations that are recently being offered awareness. One of them is underwater. The other one looks like it was irradiated with like radioactivity. But the point is that we're all the survivors of ancient people that have been on this planet for a very long period of time, longer than we even know, I think. And a lot of us, we have gone through a lot on this planet. We're all survivors, and it's going to take time to reverse miasm, right? There are a few wonderful miracle stories of various people who have, full spontaneous healings, but for the most part, it takes time. If someone takes a homeopathic route to reverse miasm, as one of them clears out, if someone is actively miasmatic, not all of us are, so we don't really have that opportunity for healing. But if someone's actively miasmatic, they take a remedy for that. It's going to be months, if not years, before the next set of symptoms rears itself to the surface, and they can work on that again. It might take 12, 13 years to find what can be considered a full reversal for this particular lifetime before we're sort of tapped out. There's obviously other modalities in many different aspects of the natural healing world, both with psychology and with physicality, that can also be utilized. There's many different pathways, right, for healing. But the point is for people to be patient with themselves if they really want to do full ancestral healing, because when we're healing ourselves in this lifetime, we're also reversing time with the healing of our past. So we're working on many different past time domains as well within especially and within our own time domains of our body. So it's going to take time and patience um, for that. And again, a lot of that work is also within that very foundational aspect that we've focused on in this talk, and that's the truth component and where we are within truth and the stories we tell ourselves. In fact, I just read a study that was done where they had a placebo group and then a group of people who had various, biomarkers for different types of what we would consider illnesses in allopathy. And all they were told to do, like a certain period of time a day, is to talk, think good thoughts and speak wonderful things to themselves. Like, I love you, you're great, you're doing wonderful, things like that. And they found measurable shifts in their biomarkers through just self talk. And so it's so important that we become more self aware. I know NLP and other different disciplines deal with this, what it is that we're saying to ourselves. Sometimes we're not even aware of what we're speaking to ourselves, or the weird songs that we have stuck in our head from the radio, and like the meaning behind those words. Like, oh, a lot of them are very nihilistic, and it's important that we become self-aware and we take a look at where the allegiances are and not. And we can find a lot of that in what triggers us, right? Like, some aspect of ourself is triggered either because we used to be like that, or there's some part of us that is that, or we're like the opposite of that to a point where we're basically on the same pendulum as that. So there's some reason, because if we weren't judging it, if it wasn't within our field and we saw someone do some weird thing, we could just be like, like, that's interesting that, they're one of those types, but not attaching ourselves to it emotionally. And so I feel like that's where a lot of the work is in our own personal like dissonance and what we would call shadow work. And there's so many different ways in which to heal and take a look at that. But that's where the work is. And if everybody on this planet was that aware and did that work, we would transform this planet and we would have no need for all of the crazy wars and things that we see happening, because we would literally all just walk away from that. There would be no participants. So I'll leave it that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So where can my listeners find you and learn more from you?
Wonderful. I have a private practice website called Your Body Electric, which is yourbodyelectric.com. I'm working on a secondary site that's not quite ready yet called The Sovereign Liaison. So it will eventually be thesovereignliaison.com, which will include more than just my private practice, right? But I do have my social miasm theory paper. If you go to social miasm theory on Journal for Scientific Exploration or type in journal 39.2, it will pop up. I also have a few variations of it, including my first dissertation variation, but a more refined variation on academia. You can take a look at it there. I have a few pages on Instagram. The one that I use the most is actually like my personal. I tend to forget about the other ones sometimes. And that is drstephinitysalazar.com, or like the subtitle is Stephinity Beyond.
And I'll make sure to link all that in the show notes for you guys so you won't have any difficulty finding that. And thank you guys so much for listening. And thank you so much, Stephinity, for joining us. And we covered so much ground that if you guys want us to have her back to unpack a little bit more, because good gravy, did we, go so many different directions, please let me know, let Stephinity know, and I'm sure we'd be down to kind of unpack it more in a future conversation. So until then, stay curious, embrace skepticism, and keep tuning in.